I don't think that people, well, actually, I know that people in general do not fully appreciate, I don't think they've even begun to appreciate, the extent to which the West as a whole, particularly Europe, is going to be impoverished as a result of the geopolitical events and the decisions made by their leaders, our leaders, over the past, several years, but really it's accelerated since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, in which the Europeans and the Americans have attempted to implement a sort of scorched earth tactic, what they perceive to be a scorched earth tactic. And why I say what they perceive, I mean, it is really a scorched earth tactic, but they are not scorching Russian earth. They are scorching the earth in Europe and the United States. Samantha Power, who I believe she's married to Cass Sunstein, a very creepy and malicious social engineer, although I'm not entirely certain that they're married. She might be married to someone else, and I could be confusing them. But either way, I remember her husband is a bad guy, just like her. She made her, her big claim to fame was back in the 90s, supposedly reporting on the war in Yugoslavia. She is a lifelong, just hater of Russia and lover of Western imperialism. But her role as the head of USAID seems to have taken her to a new level. Somehow, what Samantha Power said yesterday was, I think, the worst thing that she has ever said in her long and storied career. She's essentially shrugged her shoulders and said, you know what, there's going to be a lot less food in the world, but that's okay because green energy. There will be mass starvation. The poorest people in the world will starve, because remember, when less food is produced, it's not that it's not that everybody has a little less food to go around. The price of food goes up. So people of a certain level of means, everybody has to buy food. Everyone needs a certain amount of food to live. People of a certain means will still be able to afford to buy enough food to live. And it's the people at the very, very bottom of human society, of the global income strata, who will starve because they simply will not be able to afford enough food to live. And Samantha Powers has shrugged her shoulders and essentially accepted this and has said, hey, yeah, there's less food now than there was before. And this is because of tensions with Russia. They're not exporting as much fertilizer now. And so we in the rest of the world can't grow as much food as we otherwise would. Because for those of you unfamiliar with, I guess, the basic concept of farming, you plant crops in the ground. Those crops take up the nutrients from the soil, and they grow into food. Things like corn and wheat and fruit. And so if you just planted the same crops year after year in the same fields without fertilizing those fields, there would be no nutrients left in those fields. They would just turn to dust. It would be like a desert, and you wouldn't be able to grow very much food. You wouldn't yield much because there wouldn't be any nutrients. And so humanity has been able to maximize the amount of crops that we can grow on a given acre of land by using chemical fertilizers that are derived from fossil fuels, namely natural gas. I believe that is how nitrogen fertilizer is made, from natural gas. I'm not familiar with the chemical process of how it's made. But then there are other things that go into fertilizer, like potassium, which I believe comes from potash, which is something that is mined in Russia and Belarus largely. They're big exporters of potash. I believe Belarus is bigger than Russia. Of course, also I think Ukraine has some potash. And then the third ingredient of fertilizer, main ingredient, is phosphorus, which comes from phosphate, which is something that is available in abundance here in Florida and other places. But nevertheless, our food supply is a product of fossil fuels. That's what fertilizer is. It is a fuel for plant growth. Nitrogen in particular is, I don't know how to describe it, because I mean, obviously nitrogen by itself, is not sufficient. That's why you need other nutrients. But nitrogen, which I believe is derived from natural gas, which of course is in abundance in Russia, it's very cheap there, and so they're able to derive a lot of fertilizer from that. Plants will not grow nearly as fast or as big without it, without large quantities of nitrogen. The natural process of nitrogen fixation, if I remember correctly, it's basically a product of lightning strikes and thunderstorms, which is not something that is super predictable. So if you can control the amount of nitrogen that you are giving to the plants, you can guarantee that they're going to grow a certain amount, yield a certain quantity, and therefore we are able to maximize how much food, let's say corn, you're able to produce on a given acre of land, or a hectare, for those of you, on the metric system. And so since human civilization is currently reliant on these fertilizers, if we suddenly have a significant reduction in the quantity available to us in the West of these fertilizers, we will produce less food, and food prices will necessarily skyrocket, which ultimately will lead to the starvation of the poorest among us. And not necessarily even the poorest among us in the West. People in the West, even poor people, might have enough resources and enough buying power to procure the necessary amount of food to sustain their lives. They might not be happy about it. They might have to eat, a lot more carbohydrates, perhaps, than the Atkins crazy, or I guess they call it today keto crazy people, the low carb people in the West, who are largely upper middle class. Maybe they'll have to actually eat some rice or some bread, but they'll survive. And the same is true for people, down the economic totem pole. At the end of the day, you go to Walmart and you buy a loaf of Wonder Bread. It's not as cheap as it used to be. Certainly, it's a lot more expensive, but it's not inaccessible. But for people in other parts of the world, let's say North Africa, a place which experienced high food costs as a result of poor crop yields, which led almost directly to the Arab Spring. Let's just say that region likely this time will also have a pretty bad go at hunger. And since hunger is, so essential, if the price of food skyrockets, and your income doesn't skyrocket at the same rate, you're going to have to necessarily economize by consuming less of other goods. So whatever you would have spent your money on, other than food, you're going to have to sacrifice from other places. And, who knows, that might not all just be, frivolous discretionary spending. It might be other things that you need, like, I don't know, your rent or your electric bill. And so you might have to go, without running water, without electricity, or perhaps without even a home, just so you can pay for enough food to live. And I didn't mean to talk exclusively about food today. I wanted to talk about all of the resources that are going to be diverted away from the West as a result of our, poor leadership, burning their bridges with Russia. But really, I mean, I don't think I have time to get into everything else, because food is such a big one. And all these other ones are big ones. Food, you can look at it as almost a microcosm of everything else. Because, as I've said in the past, our standards of living in the West are a factor of how much fossil fuels we consume. As we burn more fossil fuels, as we dig more things out of the ground, like phosphate, which I consider to be a form of fossil fuel, our standards of living rise. The cost of living declines, all else equal. But, the Fed does its part to try and keep costs of living creeping higher because of inflation. But it's not that our society is not innovating and is not producing more goods. We do produce more and more every year. And I mean humanity in general, not necessarily the United States. The United States is producing a lot less stuff than it used to, but it is producing a lot of food. We have progressively gotten better and better at producing food. So much so that, it's quite fashionable to hate on and to boycott the most widely produced types of food that is chemically engineered in order to be, to have higher yields and to have, less losses. And I'm not saying this as an endorsement of Monsanto and their practices and the science behind it. I don't know necessarily. But all I have to say is that things like BT corn and Roundup Ready soybeans have made the overall food supply a lot higher than it otherwise would have been. And of course, chemical fertilizers derived from fossil fuels are a major component of that. All these things together have made food close to worthless in American society, almost free. I mean, if you're just worried about surviving, you can go to the store, buy a sack of flour, and make hardtack if you want, or biscuits, or bread every day, and it's not going to cost you very much at all. And if you use corn flour like masa harina, it's even cheaper. I mean, masa harina for like a 10-pound bag was like $2 last time I bought it. And it might not taste amazing, but I mean, you could make like a soda bread out of masa harina if you really couldn't afford wheat and you didn't want to spend the extra money. I mean, wheat flour, especially white wheat flour, throughout human history was considered a luxury. Most people were not able to consume white bread. They had to consume, other forms of bread, like barley bread. They were stuck with flours that were, less glutinous, that did not have as desirable of a texture as white bread. And so the kind of bread that you might bake with masa harina, while it might seem, certainly substandard to us today, in fact, white bread to most Americans is substandard. It would be a normal kind of thing that people would have survived on throughout human history. And again, this is a microcosm of the sorts of decisions that we're going to have to make as individuals in the coming years. As we have less and less resources available to us, we'll have to economize. We will have to do more with less, or we'll have to just do with less. As the Europeans, I heard, I should have looked up the story, but I saw, I'm pretty sure this, I'm not making this up, European officials are now recommending that people not wash their laundry so often, that in fact they just air out their clothes. And I don't go and waste water and soap and wash your clothes, unless they're really dirty. Most of the time, these pampered Europeans, they don't do any hard work. Their clothes don't actually get that dirty, and so they can just air them out and let them hang, on their balcony of their 300 square foot pod that they've been allocated by Michael Bloomberg in the company dorm, rather than wasting our precious resources and electricity and fresh water by washing their clothes. People in Europe and the United States are going to have to do more with less in terms of transportation. They're going to have to ride their bicycles more. They're going to have to drive their cars less. They're going to have to walk places. And, for a lot of us, especially in American society, our society has been built and laid out on the premise of everyone owning their own car and being able to drive places. There's not a whole lot within walking distance of where I live. It would take me a long time to walk to work, for example. I could, I guess, ride my bike to work, although the traffic is kind of scary, and I wouldn't want to get hit by a car. But I guess just in my particular case, riding a bicycle is not, the distance is not impossible now that I think about it. But for many, many people, most people I would say, a lot of them drive an hour or more to work. They commute. They live very far away from where they work. Oftentimes, they don't even live in the same town that they work in. You have these bedroom communities where people don't actually, work. They don't live a full life. They just sleep there. And then they go to work in, some big city. There was, it reminds me of, an old cartoon in the Powerpuff Girls. They had, Townsville was where the Powerpuff Girls lived. It was their fictional city. But then next door, there was Citiesville, which, wasn't a very happy place. Because nobody actually lived in Citiesville. Nobody actually liked Citiesville. They just went there to work. And then at the end of the day, everybody went home, to their own communities, where they actually enjoyed being. And this is possible, partially because of mass transit like subways, which is, and trains, which, exist in the most densely populated, well, I shouldn't say most densely populated, some cities in America, like New York, mainly. San Francisco also has a subway system. But most of America does not. Cars are essential for life in 99.9% of America's geographic landmass. So we can't simply do without when it comes to fossil fuels. And gosh, I haven't even gotten to the unraveling of our financialized economy and what we're currently witnessing on Wall Street. The Fed is in the position that if they thought at all ahead over the past 10, 12 years, this is their worst nightmare, what's going on now. Interest rates, the Fed funds rate, is basically at zero. It's at 25 basis points. And the markets are crashing. And inflation is high. The Fed has nowhere to cut. The Fed can't have an emergency 50 basis point rate cut because they don't have 50 basis points to cut. The jig is up. We're losing. The Fed is losing the battle finally. And there's still pressure on the Fed, even while this is going on, to actually hike rates because inflation is not going down. It's quite high still. And who knows where it'll be, at the end of Q2 or Q3. But if as of right now, where inflation is, the Fed doesn't have a whole lot of wiggle room to cut rates, even if they could. But that's the thing. If the Fed does, decide to cut rates, what are they going to do? Okay, so they go back to 0% interest rates, which is, a nothing change. What are we going to go back to QE infinity? We already did QE infinity. Okay, yeah, you got to the zero low bound, so you have to start quantitative easing to say, oh, we're doing more now. Well, what more are you going to do after that? We tried QE infinity. Got us by for a couple more years. Congratulations, Powell, you bought yourself some time. But now it's coming apart. Right at the time when we're experiencing a supply-side shock in the entire Western world, the likes of which we haven't seen since the 1970s with the Arab oil embargo. This is arguably worse. And honestly, this is a pivot point for the United States. As the Fed has continued to kick the can down the road as far as our financial apocalypse is concerned, they have been kicking the can down the road as far as the expiration date of the United States is concerned. Because as I've gone over before, and I don't want to go over today, this video is already too long. If the financial crisis of 2008 had played out and the Fed didn't hit the pause button and kick the can down the road, America would have already ceased to exist. The United States is on borrowed time. The government in Washington is a zombie regime. It is only perpetuated by continually rolling over its debts. If the entire U.S. financial system were to collapse, which would be the result of a depreciation in asset prices, because everyone in the U.S. financial system is levered to the hilt. They are levered up as far as they can go, and so therefore everyone is going to, if everyone's operating on leverage, if we get a market crash, you get a market-wide margin call. Everyone will have to unwind their positions. And when I say everyone, I mean everyone. Investors, brokers, homeowners, business owners, stockholders, and the government itself. And so everyone in the country, because we have this great inflationary bubble that has been blown, with the help, of course, of the Fed. But even if the Fed didn't exist, we would have these sorts of bubbles. They just wouldn't be as big. But the Fed and the banking system, the whole financial system, the fractional reserve banking itself is the ultimate origin of these sorts of crises. It's just that the Federal Reserve has expanded it to such an absurd degree. They've created, the biggest, most pus-filled boil on the surface of the earth, known as the U.S. economy. It is a boil that has festered and is ready to burst at any moment. And when it does, it will spill this disgusting pus all over the American people. And so the Fed has had to continually kick the can down the road and make that bubble even bigger and even worse. Create more zombie corporations, make the financial system in the United States even worse, so that it is even more susceptible, to even smaller pinpricks. A pinprick, let's say, the size of a 25 basis point rate hike off of the zero lower bound. Again, I will admit, I overestimated the strength of the U.S. economy. Even me, Mr. Gloom and Doom. I'm not as bad. I don't think I'm as gloomy as Peter Schiff necessarily, because Peter Schiff always thinks that every day is the end. I'm not. I try to be a little more humble and say, I don't know. It might not be today. It might be next Tuesday, but ultimately this will come to an end, and it ends badly. Silly me thought that the Fed might make it to 1%, because generally in the past they've been able to hike. I've been talking about half of what they did in the previous cycle before they burst the current bubble. It's nothing scientific about it. It's just it was just a empirical observation I made. And lo and behold, they couldn't even do that. A 25 basis point pinprick off of the zero lower bound is leading to the implosion of the United States economy. And if this continues, which, again, that's a big if, because I think the Fed will try to pull out all the stops ultimately to turn things around and to restart the bubble. But if they fail, which, not looking good, if they couldn't pull off a 25 basis point rate hike, I know I keep saying that, but I mean, it's remarkable. If they couldn't do that, how are they going to turn this ship around? Again, this is independent of the supply side issues that we're going through. These supply side issues are an additional, they're additional pinpricks. They're real big pins. They're like, they're like hypodermic needles. I don't know, or bigger than that. I don't know what's big. I don't like needles, actually. I don't want to think of bigger needles. So I've already gone way too long. I will get into this in more detail probably later this week. So with that said, I will see you folks back here tomorrow.